morning and welcome to Morning Movie News, where today I want to discuss Robert Pattinson. Yes, Robert Pattinson, long the butt of jokes thanks to his involvement with the Twilight franchise. And I think that while that gave him a career, at what cost has become the question that not only Pattinson is asking himself, but I think his Twilight co-stars have been asking themselves as well. I mean, both Kristen Stewart and Taylor Lautner had some high-profile movies come out after Twilight, but none of them really stuck. I think Kristen Stewart had the best shot with Snow White and the Huntsman, but as anyone who's seen that movie will tell you, she blew it by sucking in the movie. But anyway, Robert Pattinson, in comparison to Taylor Lautner and Kristen Stewart, has had, laid pretty low. He hasn't done as much work. I mean, he was in Cosmopolis, of course, that David Cronenberg film, which, while it wasn't widely seen or widely praised, still kind of, started to put him in a new direction, a new path, where he was working with quality filmmakers. And I think that the situation with Cosmopolis was that people felt, Cronenberg was kind of slumming. But I think that it was a necessary step for Pattinson to maybe a stepping stone to continue to work on these kind of prestige films. And he has more booked, which is what we're going to be discussing today. But one thing I want to say, though, is I think that the thing that happened that really caused him to break from Twilight was his breaking up with Kristen Stewart, which I'm sure sucked personally for him. I mean, even if their relationship was just a PR stunt, it still was embarrassing. But I think it put him in a really positive, sympathetic light with all the interviews that he gave. Kind of like the way divorcing, they didn't break up, they divorced, the way divorcing Tom Cruise did for Nicole Kidman. That took her from being someone who wasn't actually very well liked while she was married to Tom Cruise to really becoming, a fan favorite, getting, a strong audience support and becoming a more mainstream actress. Of course, she had The Others and Moulin Rouge come out at the same time. It was kind of like the perfect storm, and I think Pattinson is kind of brewing his own perfect storm. But anyway, he was very likable and sympathetic in his interviews about the Kristen Stewart breakup, very tasteful, and I think it made him seem like endearingly loopy, like he was a little bit out of his league, but he was trying, and that's what I liked about his interviews, and that's why I've taken a little bit more of an interest in him than I have in Lautner or Stewart. So anyway, of course, after Cosmopolis, he has the other film coming out. I reviewed the trailer recently. I'll put a link at the end to The Rover. And this is an Australian film, and he's starring opposite Guy Pearce. And while Guy Pearce kind of dominates the trailer, Robert Pattinson indeed looks very different in the movie, almost unrecognizable. And he looks to be actually doing a good job and taking this very seriously. So I thought that was very exciting. And it made me compare him to Leonardo DiCaprio. And some of you might think, oh, how dare you utter them in the same sentence. But don't forget that, in his Titanic days, and when The Beach was coming out, which I think was kind of a Cosmopolis type step, Leonardo DiCaprio was a heartthrob himself. That's one of the reasons Titanic did so well. There was a lot of stories at the time about how a lot of Asian schoolgirls were just seeing Titanic, Twilight, so similar, seeing Titanic on a loop because they thought Leonardo DiCaprio was so gorgeous. And so I think that he kind of had that Beach was his Growing Pains movie, and so that's why I liken Cosmopolis to it. And I see similarities with the path that Robert Pattinson is taking. So he has The Rover coming out. I think it looks very good. But then also a whole bunch of other movies kind of have come to light that he's working on that I also think will benefit him. For instance, one is called Life, where he stars opposite Dane DeHaan, another hot, up-and-coming young talent. But interestingly, it's about James Dean and a photographer that he befriended, and also that photographer took that famous iconic picture of James Dean in the rain in New York City. So it's about that relationship, but fascinatingly, Robert Pattinson isn't playing James Dean. That's Dane DeHaan's role. Robert Pattinson is playing the photographer. And I think it's very smart of Robert Pattinson to play a role that doesn't focus on his looks and let Dane DeHaan do that. I mean, Dane DeHaan is so bizarre and kind of like weirdly good looking that kind of will allow him to, I think for both of them it's a good pushing the edge of the envelope. For DeHaan to play a heartthrob, I think is a great choice for him, and for Robert Pattinson to play the regular, non-famous guy is a great choice for him. So that sounds like a very interesting project. And then also he's going to be in The Lost City of Z opposite Benedict Cumberbatch, and I think that's a fascinating choice. And this is also, I believe, a project that Brad Pitt was circling for a while. So I think that I would actually put Pattinson in league with DiCaprio and Brad Pitt as actors, heartthrob actors, pretty boy actors, who, by really insisting on it and working on prestige projects, were able to totally change their personas. And so I think that Pattinson looks like this might actually work. So I'm curious with you guys. Do you agree with me? Do you think Pattinson is reshaping his movie star image? or is there just nothing that can make you take him seriously? So I'm curious, and go check out that Rover trailer and tell me what you think of that as well. All right, so the second story of the day is West Side Story. A lot of you asked me to cover this, and that's that it was, the news broke last week that Fox had opened up the rights to a remake for West Side Story because none other than Steven Spielberg had asked for it. So I guess previously the rights weren't available, but they suddenly came into play when Spielberg, I guess on a whim, said, maybe I'll make a musical. I'd like to remake West Side Story. And a lot of people were like, right away, this is blasphemy. First Annie, now West Side Story. What the hell, Hollywood? Why don't you come up with an original idea? But don't forget that West Side Story is a take on Romeo and Juliet itself, so that's not an original idea either. But the original film is very good, but it's also very dated. I mean, there are a lot of funny sketches. I even wrote a comedy sketch about, the way the gangs are depicted in West Side Story, the way they snap their fingers and dance. Dance gangs. I think that's very humorous, but still a very good movie. And there's some very good songs. And it was also a very unique film for its time in that it was a diverse film. It had like the Maria, the Natalie Wood character, but then also talked about, immigrants, Latino immigrants to this country. That was the Romeo and Juliet situation you had going on. So that's a great iconic song from there, America. Now I've seen some people covering this since the news was broken, and they said, well, would it be interesting to apply this Romeo and Juliet, different nationalities against each other, perhaps to a different setting, like the Middle East maybe. There are a lot of Americans over there because of the war. Maybe you could do something interesting there. And so I don't know if Spielberg's that creative as a producer. I think he's a very good director. I really like his work, but I don't think he's not a Gus Van Sant. He doesn't push the edge of the envelope. Somebody else has to come up with that idea, and then sometimes he steps in. But then usually not even then. I think he probably wants to make a more straight West Side Story, but if they could up the danger quotient and probably make it a little more real, I would be all for that. I just hope it doesn't go the route of the Annie remake, which to me doesn't seem very different at all, and just seems actually just more TV-like. I would like to see a very cinematic West Side Story that also, because you remember when that film was shot, not really a film shot on location, shot on sound stages, and it doesn't, that doesn't hurt the movie, but it doesn't feel real. Today movies seem more real, so they could bring that element in as well. I think it could be good. So, never say never. It's not like they're remaking My Fair Lady. I would just have a fit over that. I think West Side Story, while a very good, musical and very famous musical, it just doesn't seem like quite as sacred a cow to me. So I'm curious to how you guys feel. Would you be open to this? And under what circumstances should you make a remake? When I reviewed the Annie trailer, I compared it to the Karate Kid remake. Both are done by Will Smith for his children. Only Willow opted out of Annie. But still, I thought the Karate Kid changed enough around by moving the action to China, changing, the story, from Pat Morita, changing the Jackie Chan version to be a little bit more serious, have a little more weight to it. So I'm just curious to how you guys feel and what changes you would like to see in West Side Story to warrant a remake, or you just think an update is enough. So that's the second story of the day. The third story is about Max Brooks, who of course wrote World War Z. And he has a graphic novel coming out that's already been picked up as a movie. And of course, we've discussed this before, that a lot of talent in Hollywood goes the graphic novel route, not really because they care about creating a great graphic novel, but it's a good way to kind of get a visual pitch to Hollywood. So it's unfortunate. I don't like that. I don't like hijacking a medium for business purposes when you have no intention of trying to please comic book audiences. I think it's very selfish, and I think comic books are their own medium, their own legitimate medium. They're not just like storyboards for you to show it to a studio executive. But anyway, Max Brooks, it's called the Harlem Hell Fighters, and it's about an African-American regiment in World War I. That's what I found very fascinating. An African-American regiment in World War I, of course, glory covered African-American soldiers who fought in the Civil War. But this is during World War I, and this is a real-life regiment that actually ended up spending more time in combat than any American regiment, white or black. But of course, I think the hook here is that they still had to fight racism when they came home. Racism was their greatest battle. It seems very Hollywood. And I think this is a good story to tell. When I watched on the History Channel, like the America, the Story of Us, I was really surprised at the diversity that's always existed in America from the time before we were a country. Talking about the rumors that Lafayette was a homosexual, and that's why he was kicked out of France, and that there were people of all kinds of races living in the United States with the Pilgrims. And I guess I get upset and frustrated that history, the history books here in the United States and the films have whitewashed our history, and we've always been a country of cultural diversity, and people always are complaining about our melting pot being not more of a chunky stew, but I think that it seems to me that that was always the case, and just a select group of people in charge decided to lie about it, which I find very frustrating. So I'm all for movies like this that show you that African Americans have been fighting in the military, not just since the Civil War, but they didn't just disappear for a long time until more current times. They were fighting in World War I. So I think this sounds like a great story. It's going to have to compete with Glory because they're very similar stories, and Glory is such a magnificent movie. If you've never seen Glory, go rent it. It's such a great film. Put Denzel Washington on the map. It was one of Morgan Freeman's early films. Matthew Broderick, of course. Just great story. And so this movie will have to compete with that. And I wonder if Max Brooks, doing such a pulpy genre-y story like World War Z, I wonder if he kind of can get the depth necessary to make a film like this really stand out and be special instead of, too genre-y. Because this is a very delicate subject matter. I mean, I guess you could go the Inglourious Basterds route, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, and there's also a cliche here about the whole, racism angle at home, which of course is totally warranted and was a genuine problem for these people. But it leads into the viewer question, actually. I'm going to link these two stories together because Nile Jordan, that's a very good name, not in the Nile, just like Country Jordan. I think that's a great name. Nile Jordan says, "Hey Grace, I'm a first-time questioner, and I love your videos on this page and Think About the Ink. Thank you, Nile." And Nile says, "In the past few years, there have been a lot of slave black help movies, such as The Help, 12 Years a Slave, Django, and even The Blind Side. And as an African American, I am tired of all these movies where the white man takes advantage of the black man. Why do these movies get so big, and when do you think these types of movies will die down? Thanks for answering." Thanks for asking, Niall. I think it's a great question, and as you can see, I think it's very relevant with, for instance, not only all the films that came out in 2013, most of which were ignored by the Academy, I think unfortunately so, but also this Max Brooks story about this Harlem Hell Fighters coming out. But I think that Harlem Hell Fighters to some degree still ties into what you're talking about, Niall, about, racism is front and center instead of these characters just being real characters. And I think what you're going to have, I think the evolution of, more black movie stars will help. Of course, like for instance, Will Smith in Hitch. Or The Pursuit of Happiness to some degree. I mean, those are movies where I think that any race could have been the lead. Those weren't black-specific roles. So I think Will Smith has been doing a lot with this because of his star power. Hancock, also, for instance, another. You can look at a lot of Will Smith movies. I think Kevin Hart is being very helpful. Ride Along. When I went to see that movie, I thought it was not only a good movie, but I thought it was interesting that anybody could have been cast in those roles. Again, not race-specific. Jamie Foxx. Jamie Foxx does more race-specific roles, but, although Collateral, the film he made with Tom Cruise, also hopefully race won't be a factor in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So I think that when you have movie stars that can bring audiences in, you start to see them not become more race-blind casting. And also maybe this is just a movement. But I think the reason you see a lot of movies like this where, the white man is keeping somebody down or the white man's helping them is because the films are being made by, white filmmakers. And I think that they're being not only made but greenlit by white filmmakers and white producers and white studio heads. And that's just unfortunately how they're seeing the situation. They're like, okay, well, what interests me? And also, when you want to win an Oscar, which is another big thing, you need to have these sob stories, which is why they look at 12 Years a Slave. Not that I'm not trying to say that's just, it's write it off as a sob story, but that was the most Oscar-friendly narrative, and it was the most, I think it was very bold and new in the way it showed a slave story, but at the same time it was, you would think things had changed since Roots. It's still the same kind of story, even if it's told in a, very exciting, more sophisticated manner. But anyway, so that's why I think it is. I think until you have more black people working in Hollywood, or African Americans in positions of power, whether it be star power. Will Packer is becoming a very successful producer in Hollywood. He's churning out a lot of roles that are not race-specific. That's when you'll see this start to happen. So I think it's beginning, but I think it all boils down to who's making the decisions and you know, and also whether or not, because you know, there are two things that come into play when you're making a movie. Will it win awards, or will it do well at the box office? And you know, only recently have, you know, quote unquote black films been doing very well at the box office. Tyler Perry's films have done kind of well, but he's been kind of like a subgenre, a very soapy, melodramatic subgenre. But you know, now we're having a lot of black films that are competing on par with Hollywood fare. So that's the only reason films are greenlight. And I guess maybe that might be the reason for Oscar wins, or awards wins, or for box office. And because black films weren't viable at the box office previously, you had you know, people only greenlighting stories that they felt were sympathetic to for award season, and that tends to be the kind of story you're talking about, Niall. So we'll see what happens going forward. I'm curious to how everybody else feels. Are you tired of these kind of, you know, race stories? Are you tired of seeing black characters only through that lens? Or do you prefer the direction that Jamie Foxx, Will Smith, and Kevin Hart are taking everyone, you know, films to a more race-blind place? Do you think that's possible? Do you predict a day when white audiences will go and see a movie with a, you know, a black lead? I mean, it has happened with Will Smith. I think that it can work. So I'm wondering, do you think if any other talent can achieve that? So write your thoughts down below. Thank you for everybody for tuning in, and I hope you'll write down below what you think of today's 3 stories, the viewer question, and anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow, and any questions you might have. Thanks for watching. Bye.